The Man in Lower 10, Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 18, A New World. Hotchkiss jotted down the bits of telegram and rose. "Well," he said, "we've done something. We've found where the murderer left the train, we know what day he went to Baltimore, and most important of all, we have a motive for the crime." "It seems the irony of fate," said McKnight, getting up, "that a man should kill another man for certain papers he's supposed to be carrying, find he hasn't got them after all, decide to throw suspicion on another man by changing berths and getting out, bag and baggage, and then, by the merest fluke of chance, take with him, in the valise he changed for his own, the very notes he was after. It was a bit of luck for him." "Then why," put in Hotchkiss doubtfully, "why did he collapse when he heard of the wreck? And what about the telephone message the station agent sent? You remember they tried to countermand it, and with some excitement." "We will ask him those questions when we get him," McKnight said. We were on the unrailed front porch by that time, and Hotchkiss had put away his notebook. The mother of the twins followed us to the steps. "Dear me," she exclaimed volubly, "and to think I was forgetting to tell you. I put the young man to bed with a spice poultice on his ankle. My mother always was a firm believer in spice poultices. It's wonderful what they will do in croup. And then I took the children and went down to see the wreck. It was Sunday, and the mister had gone to church. Hasn't missed a day since he took the pledge 9 years ago. And on the way, I met 2 people, a man and a woman. They looked half dead, so I sent them right here for breakfast and some soap and water. I always say soap is better than liquor after a shock." Hotchkiss was listening absently. McKnight was whistling under his breath, staring down across the field to where a break in the woods showed a half-dozen telegraph poles, the line of the railroad. "It must have been 12 o'clock when we got back. I wanted the children to see everything, because it isn't likely they'll ever see another wreck like that. Rows of—" "About 12 o'clock, I broke in. "And what then?" "The young man upstairs was awake," she went on, "and hammering at his door like all possessed, and it was locked on the outside." She paused to enjoy her sensation. "I would like to see that lock," Hotchkiss said promptly, but for some reason the woman demurred. "I will bring the key down," she said, and disappeared. When she returned, she held out an ordinary door key of the cheapest variety. "We had to break the lock," she volunteered, "and the key didn't turn up for 2 days. Then one of the twins found the turkey gobbler trying to swallow it. It has been washed since," she hastened to assure Hotchkiss, who showed an inclination to drop it. "You don't think he locked the door himself and threw the key out of the window?" the little man asked. "The windows are covered with mosquito netting nailed on. The mister blamed it on the children, and it might have been Obadiah. He's the quiet kind, and you never know what he's about." "He's about to strangle, isn't he?" McKnight remarked lazily. "Or is that Obadiah?" Mrs. Carter picked the boy up and inverted him, talking amiably all the time. "He's always doing it," she said, giving him a shake. "Whenever we miss anything, we look to see if Obadiah's black in the face." She gave him another shake, and the quarter I had given him shot out as if blown from a gun. Then we prepared to go back to the station. From where I stood, I could look into the cheery farm kitchen where Alison West and I had eaten our al fresco breakfast. I looked at the table with mixed emotions, and then, gradually, the meaning of something on it penetrated my mind. Still in its papers, evidently just opened, was a hat box, and protruding over the edge of the box was a streamer of vivid green ribbon. On the plea that I wished to ask Mrs. Carter a few more questions, I let the others go on. I watched them down the flagstone walk, saw McKnight stop and examine the gateposts, and saw, too, the quick glance he threw back at the house. Then I turned to Mrs. Carter. "I would like to speak to the young lady upstairs," I said. She threw up her hands with a quick gesture of surrender. "I've done all I could," she exclaimed. "She won't like it very well, but—" She's in the room over the parlor. I went eagerly up the ladder-like stairs to the rag-carpeted hall. 2 doors were open, showing interiors of 4 poster beds and high bureaus. The door of the room over the parlor was almost closed. I hesitated in the hallway. After all, what right had I to intrude on her? But she settled my difficulty by throwing open the door and facing me. I beg your pardon, Miss West, I stammered. It has just occurred to me that I am unpardonably rude. I saw the hat downstairs and I guessed. The hat, she said. I might have known. Does Richie know I am here? I don't think so. I turned to go down the stairs again. Then I halted. The fact is, I said, in an attempt at justification, I'm in rather a mess these days, and I'm apt to do irresponsible things. It is not impossible that I shall be arrested in a day or so for the murder of Simon Harrington. She drew her breath in sharply. Murder, she echoed. Then they have found you after all. I don't regard it as anything more than inconvenient, I lied. They can't convict me, you know. Almost all the witnesses are dead. She was not deceived for a moment. She came over to me and stood, both hands on the rail of the stair. I know just how grave it is, she said quietly. My grandfather will not leave one stone unturned, and he can be terrible, terrible. But she looked directly into my eyes as I stood below her on the stairs. The time may come, soon, when I can help you. I'm afraid I shall not want to. I'm a dreadful coward, Mr. Blakely. But I will. She tried to smile. I wish you would let me help you, I said unsteadily. Let us make it a bargain. Each help the other. The girl shook her head with a sad little smile. I am only as unhappy as I deserve to be, she said. And when I protested and took a step toward her, she retreated with her hands out before her. Why don't you ask me all the questions you are thinking? She demanded, with a catch in her voice. Oh, I know them. Or are you afraid to ask? I looked at her, at the lines around her eyes, at the drawn look about her mouth. Then I held out my hand. Afraid, I said, as she gave me hers. There is nothing in God's green earth I'm afraid of, save of trouble for you. To ask questions would be to imply a lack of faith. I ask you nothing. Someday, perhaps, you will come to me yourself and let me help you. The next moment, I was out in the golden sunshine. The birds were singing carols of joy. I walked dizzily through rainbow-colored clouds, past the twins, cherubs now, swinging on the gate. It was a new world into which I stepped from the Carter farmhouse that morning, for I had kissed her. Chapter 19. At the table next, McKnight and Hotchkiss were sauntering slowly down the road as I caught up with them. As usual, the little man was busy with some abstruse mental problem. The idea is this, he was saying, his brows knitted in thought. If a left-handed man, standing in the position of the man in the picture, should jump from a car, would he be likely to sprain his right ankle? When a right-handed man prepares for a leap of that kind, my theory is that he would hold on with his right hand and alight at the proper time on his right foot. Of course, I imagine, although I don't know, interrupted McKnight, that a man either ambidextrous or one-armed, jumping from the Washington Flyer, would be more likely to land on his head. Anyhow, I interposed, what difference does it make whether Sullivan used one hand or the other? One pair of handcuffs will put both hands out of commission. As usual, when one of his pet theories was attacked, Hotchkiss looked aggrieved. My dear sir, he expostulated, don't you understand what bearing this has on the case? How was the murdered man lying when he was found? On his back, I said promptly, head toward the engine. Very well, he retorted, and what then? Your heart lies under your fifth intercostal space, and to reach it a right-handed blow would have struck either down or directly in. But, gentlemen, the point of entrance for the stiletto was below the heart, striking up. As Harrington lay with his head toward the engine, a person in the aisle must have used the left hand. McKnight's eyes sought mine, and he winked at me solemnly as I unostentatiously transferred the hat I was carrying to my right hand. Long training has largely counterbalanced heredity in my case, but I still pitch ball, play tennis, and carve with my left hand. But Hotchkiss was too busy with his theories to notice me. We were only just in time for our train back to Baltimore, but McKnight took advantage of a second's delay to shake the station agent warmly by the hand. "I want to express my admiration for you," he said beamingly. "Ability of your order is thrown away here. You should have been a city policeman, my friend." The agent looked a trifle uncertain. "The young lady was the one who told me to keep still," he said. McKnight glanced at me, gave the agent's hand a final shake, and climbed on board. But I knew perfectly that he had guessed the reason for my delay. He was very silent on the way home. Hotchkiss, too, had little to say. He was reading over his notes intently, stopping now and then to make a penciled addition. Just before we left the train, Richie turned to me. "I suppose it was the key to the door that she tied to the gate?" "Probably. I did not ask her." "Curious, her locking that fellow in," he reflected. "You may depend on it. There was a good reason for it all, and I wish you wouldn't be so suspicious of motives, Rich," I said warmly. "Only yesterday you were the suspicious one," he retorted, and we lapsed into strained silence. It was late when we got to Washington. One of Mrs. Clopton's small tyrannies was exacting punctuality at meals, and like several other things, I respected it. There are always some concessions that should be made in return for faithful service. So, as my dinner hour of 7 was long past, McKnight and I went to a little restaurant downtown where they have a very decent way of fixing chicken à la king. Hotchkiss had departed, economically bent, for a small hotel where he lived on the American plan. "I want to think some things over," he said, in response to my invitation to dinner, "and anyhow, there's no use dining out when I pay the same, dinner or no dinner, where I am stopping." The day had been hot, and the first-floor dining room was sultry in spite of the palms and fans, which attempted to simulate the verdure and breezes of the country. It was crowded, too, with a typical summer night crowd, and after sitting for a few minutes in a sweltering corner, we got up and went to the smaller dining room upstairs. Here it was not so warm, and we settled ourselves comfortably by a window. Over in a corner, half a dozen boys on their way back to school were ragging a perspiring waiter, a proceeding so exactly to McKnight's taste that he insisted on going over to join them. But their table was full, and somehow that kind of fun had lost its point for me. Not far from us, a very stout, middle-aged man, apoplectic with the heat, was elephantinely jolly for the benefit of a bored-looking girl across the table from him, and at the next table a newspaper woman ate alone, the last edition propped against the water bottle before her, her hat, for coolness, on the corner of the table. It was a motley bohemian crowd. I looked over the room casually while McKnight ordered the meal. Then my attention was attracted to the table next to ours. Two people were sitting there, so deep in conversation that they did not notice us. The woman's face was hidden under her hat as she traced the pattern of the cloth mechanically with her fork. But the man's features stood out clear in the light of the candles on the table. It was Bronson. "He shows the strain, doesn't he?" McKnight said, holding up the wine list as if he read from it. "Who's the woman?" "Search me," I replied in the same way. When the chicken came, I still found myself gazing now and then at the abstracted couple near me. Evidently, the subject of conversation was unpleasant. Bronson was eating little, the woman not at all. Finally, he got up, pushed his chair back noisily, thrust a bill at the waiter, and stalked out. The woman sat still for a moment. Then, with an apparent resolution to make the best of it, she began slowly to eat the meal before her. But the quarrel had taken away her appetite. for the mixture in our chafing dish was hardly ready to serve before she pushed her chair back a little and looked around the room. I caught my first glimpse of her face then, and I confess it startled me. It was the tall, stately woman of the Ontario, the woman I had last seen cowering beside the road, rolling pebbles in her hand, blood streaming from a cut over her eye. I could see the scar now, a little affair about an inch long, gleaming red through its layers of powder. And then, quite unexpectedly, she turned and looked directly at me. After a minute's uncertainty, she bowed, letting her eyes rest on mine with a calmly insolent stare. She glanced at McKnight for a moment, then back to me. When she looked away again, I breathed easier. "Who is it?" asked McKnight under his breath. "Ontario." I formed it with my lips rather than said it. McKnight's eyebrows went up, and he looked with increased interest at the black-gowned figure. I ate little after that. The situation was rather bad for me, I began to see. Here was a woman who could, if she wished, and had any motive for so doing, put me in jail under a capital charge. A word from her to the police and polite surveillance would become active interference. Then, too, she could say that she had seen me, just after the wreck, with a young woman from the murdered man's car, and thus probably bring Alison West into the case. It is not surprising, then, that I ate little. The woman across seemed in no hurry to go. She loitered over a demitasse, and that finished, sat with her elbow on the table, her chin in her hand, looking darkly at the changing groups in the room. The fun at the table where the college boys sat began to grow a little noisy. The fat man, now a purplish shade, ambled away behind his slim companion. The newspaper woman pinned on her businesslike hat and stalked out. Still, the woman at the next table waited. It was a relief when the meal was over. We got our hats and were about to leave the room when a waiter touched me on the arm. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said, "but the lady at the table near the window, the lady in black, sir, would like to speak to you." I looked down between the rows of tables to where the woman sat alone, her chin still resting on her hand, her black eyes still insolently staring, this time at me. "I'll have to go," I said to McKnight hurriedly. "She knows all about that affair, and she'd be a bad enemy." "I don't like her lamps," McKnight observed, after a glance at her. "Better jolly her a little. Goodbye." Chapter 20. The Notes and a Bargain. I went back slowly to where the woman sat alone. She smiled rather oddly as I drew near, and pointed to the chair Bronson had vacated. "Sit down, Mr. Blakely," she said. "I'm going to take a few minutes of your valuable time." "Certainly." I sat down opposite her and glanced at a cuckoo clock on the wall. "I am sorry, but I have only a few minutes. If you—" She laughed a little, not very pleasantly, and opening a small black fan covered with spangles, waved it slowly. "The fact is," she said, "I think we are about to make a bargain." "A bargain?" I asked incredulously. "You have a second advantage of me. You know my name?" I paused suggestively, and she took the cue. "I am Mrs. Conway," she said, and flicked a crumb off the table with an over-manicured finger. The name was scarcely a surprise. I had already surmised that this might be the woman whom rumour credited as being Bronson's common-law wife. Rumour, I remembered, had said other things even less pleasant, things which had been brought out at Bronson's arrest for forgery. "We met last under less fortunate circumstances," she was saying. "I have been fit for nothing since that terrible day. And you had a broken arm, I think." "I still have it," I said, with a lame attempt at jocularity. "But to have escaped at all was a miracle. We have much, indeed, to be thankful for." "I suppose we have," she said carelessly, "although sometimes I doubt it." She was looking somberly toward the door through which her late companion had made his exit. "You sent for me?" I said. "Yes, I sent for you." She roused herself and sat erect. "Now, Mr. Blakely, have you found those papers?" "The papers? What papers?" I parried. I needed time to think. "Mr. Blakely," she said quietly, "I think we can lay aside all subterfuge. In the first place, let me refresh your mind about a few things. The Pittsburgh police are looking for the survivors of the car Ontario. There are 3 that I know of. Yourself, the young woman with whom you left the scene of the wreck, and myself. The wreck, you will admit, was a fortunate one for you." I nodded without speaking. "At the time of the collision you were in rather a hole," she went on, looking at me with a disagreeable smile. "You were, if I remember, accused of a rather atrocious crime. There was a lot of corroborative evidence, was there not? I seem to remember a dirk and the murdered man's pocketbook in your possession, and a few other things that were, well, rather unpleasant." I was thrown a bit off my guard. "You remember also," I said quickly, "that a man disappeared from the car, taking my clothes, papers, and everything?" "I remember that you said so." Her tone was quietly insulting, and I bit my lip at having been caught. It was no time to make a defense. "You have missed one calculation," I said coldly, "and that is the discovery of the man who left the train." "You have found him?" She bent forward, and again I regretted my hasty speech. "I knew it. I said so." "We are going to find him," I asserted, with a confidence I did not feel. "We can produce at any time proof that a man left the flyer a few miles beyond the wreck, and we can find him, I am positive." "But you have not found him yet?" She was clearly disappointed. "Well, so be it. Now for our bargain. You will admit that I am no fool." I made no such admission, and she smiled mockingly. "How flattering you are," she said. "Very well. Now for the premises. You take to Pittsburgh 4 notes held by the Mechanics' National Bank to have Mr. Gilmore, who is ill, declare his endorsement of them forged. On the journey back to Pittsburgh, 2 things happen to you. You lose your clothing, your valise, and your papers, including the notes, and you are accused of murder. In fact, Mr. Blakely, the circumstances were most singular, and the evidence, well, almost conclusive." I was completely at her mercy, but I gnawed my lip with irritation. "Now for the bargain." She leaned over and lowered her voice. "A fair exchange, you know. The minute you put those 4 notes in my hand, that minute the blow to my head has caused complete forgetfulness as to the events of that awful morning. I am the only witness, and I will be silent. Do you understand? They will call off their dogs." My head was buzzing with the strangeness of the idea. "But," I said, striving to gain time, "I haven't the notes. I can't give you what I haven't got." "You have had the case continued," she said sharply. "You expect to find them. Another thing," she added slowly, watching my face, "if you don't get them soon, Bronson will have them. They have been offered to him already, but at a prohibitive price." "But," I said, bewildered, "what is your object in coming to me? If Bronson will get them anyhow—" She shut her fan with a click, and her face was not particularly pleasant to look at. "You are dense," she said insolently. "I want those papers for myself, not for Andy Bronson." "Then the idea is," I said, ignoring her tone, "that you think you have me in a hole, and that if I find those papers and give them to you, you will let me out. As I understand it, our friend Bronson, under those circumstances, will also be in a hole." She nodded. "The notes would be of no use to you for a limited length of time," I went on, watching her narrowly. "If they are not turned over to the state's attorney within a reasonable time, there will have to be a nolle pros. That is, the case will simply be dropped for lack of evidence." "A week would answer, I think," she said slowly. "You will do it then?" I laughed, although I was not especially cheerful. "No, I'll not do it. I expect to come across the notes any time now, and I expect just as certainly to turn them over to the state's attorney when I get them." She got up suddenly, pushing her chair back with a noisy grating sound that turned many eyes toward us. "You're more of a fool than I thought you," she sneered, and left me at the table. Chapter 21. McKnight's Theory. I confess I was staggered. The people at the surrounding tables, after glancing curiously in my direction, looked away again. I got my hat and went out in a very uncomfortable frame of mind. That she would inform the police at once of what she knew I never doubted, unless possibly she would give a day or two's grace in the hope that I would change my mind. I reviewed the situation as I waited for a car. Two passed me going in the opposite direction, and on the first one I saw Bronson, his hat over his eyes, his arms folded, looking moodily ahead. Was it imagination? Or was the small man huddled in the corner of the rear seat Hotchkiss? As the car rolled on, I found myself smiling. The alert little man was for all the world like a terrier, ever on the scent and scouring about in every direction. I found McKnight at the incubator with his coat off, working with enthusiasm and a manicure file over the horn of his auto. "It's the worst horn I ever ran across," he groaned without looking up as I came in. "The blankety-blank thing won't blow." He punched it savagely, finally eliciting a faint, throaty croak. "Sounds like croup," I suggested. "My sister-in-law uses camphor and goose grease for it. Or how about a spice poultice?" But McKnight never sees any jokes but his own. He flung the horn clattering into a corner and collapsed sulkily into a chair. "Now," I said, "if you're through manicuring that horn, I'll tell you about my talk with the lady in black." "What's wrong?" asked McKnight languidly. "Police watching her too?" "Not exactly. The fact is, Rich, there's the mischief to pay." Stogie came in, bringing a few additions to our comfort. When he went out, I told my story. "You must remember," I said, "that I had seen this woman before the morning of the wreck. She was buying her Pullman ticket when I did. Then the next morning, when the murder was discovered, she grew hysterical, and I gave her some whiskey. The third and last time I saw her, until tonight, was when she crouched beside the road, after the wreck." McKnight slid down in his chair until his weight rested on the small of his back and put his feet on the big reading table. "It is rather a facer," he said. "It's really too good a situation for a commonplace lawyer. It ought to be dramatized. You can't agree, of course, and by refusing you run the chance of jail at least, and of having Allison brought into publicity, which is out of the question. You say she was at the Pullman window when you were?" "Yes, I bought her ticket for her, gave her lower 11. "And you took 10? "Lower 10. McKnight straightened up and looked at me. "Then she thought you were in lower 10. "I suppose she did, if she thought at all." "But listen, man." McKnight was growing excited. "What do you figure out of this? The Conway woman knows you have taken the notes to Pittsburgh. The probabilities are that she follows you there on the chance of an opportunity to get them, either for Bronson or herself. Nothing doing during the trip over or during the day in Pittsburgh, but she learns the number of your berth as you buy it at the Pullman ticket office in Pittsburgh, and she thinks she sees her chance. No one could have foreseen that that drunken fellow would have crawled into your berth. Now I figure it out this way. She wanted those notes desperately, does still, not for Bronson, but to hold over his head for some purpose. In the night, when everything is quiet, she slips behind the curtains of lower 10, where the man's breathing shows he is asleep. Didn't you say he snored? He did, I affirmed. But I tell you, now keep still and listen. She gropes cautiously around in the darkness, finally discovering the wallet under the pillow. Can't you see it yourself? He was leaning forward excitedly, and I could almost see the gruesome tragedy he was depicting. She draws out the wallet. Then perhaps she remembers the alligator bag, and on the possibility that the notes are there instead of in the pocketbook, she gropes around for it. Suddenly, the man awakes and clutches at the nearest object, perhaps her neck chain, which breaks. She drops the pocketbook and tries to escape, but he has caught her right hand. It is all in silence. The man is still stupidly drunk, but he holds her in a tight grip. Then the tragedy. She must get away. In a minute, the car will be aroused. Such a woman, on such an errand, does not go without some sort of a weapon, in this case, a dagger, which, unlike a revolver, is noiseless. With a quick thrust, she's a big woman and a bold one, she strikes. Possibly Hotchkiss is right about the left-hand blow. Harrington may have held her right hand, or perhaps she held the dirk in her left hand as she groped with her right. Then, as the man falls back and his grasp relaxes, she straightens and attempts to get away. The swaying of the car throws her almost into your berth, and trembling with terror, she crouches behind the curtains of lower 10 until everything is still. Then she goes noiselessly back to her berth. I nodded. It seems to fit partly, at least, I said. In the morning, when she found that the crime had been not only fruitless, but that she had searched the wrong berth and killed the wrong man, when she saw me emerge, unhurt, just as she was bracing herself for the discovery of my dead body, then she went into hysterics. You remember, I gave her some whiskey. It really seems a tenable theory, but like the Sullivan theory, there are one or two things that don't agree with the rest. For one thing, how did the remainder of that chain get into Alison West's possession? She may have picked it up on the floor. We'll admit that, I said, and I'm sure I hope so. Then how did the murdered man's pocketbook get into the sealskin bag? And the dirk? How account for that? And the blood stains? Now what's the use, asked McKnight aggrievedly, of my building up beautiful theories for you to pull down? We'll take it to Hotchkiss. Maybe he can tell from the bloodstains if the murderer's fingernails were square or pointed. Hotchkiss is no fool, I said warmly. Under all his theories, there's a good hard layer of common sense. And we must remember, Rich, that neither of our theories includes the woman at Dr. Van Kirk's hospital, that the charming picture you have just drawn does not account for Alison West's connection with the case, or for the bits of telegram in the Sullivan fellow's pajamas pocket. You are like the man who put the clock together. You've got half of the works left over. Oh, go home, said McKnight disgustedly. I'm no Edgar Allan Poe. What's the use of coming here and asking me things if you're so particular? With one of his quick changes of mood, he picked up his guitar. Listen to this, he said. It is a Hawaiian song about a fat lady, oh, ignorant one, and how she fell off her mule. But for all the lightness of the words, the voice that followed me down the stairs was anything but cheery. There was a Kanaka in Balu did dwell, who had for his daughter a monstrous fat girl. He sang in his clear tenor. I paused on the lower floor and listened. He had stopped singing as abruptly as he had begun.